Hey guys, back for the second half of this tutorial. This is the Halflingers tutorial. So picking up where we left off, we're going to move on to the ears and the mane. And by comparing the now enlarged section of this picture compared to the charcoal rendering, you can see that one of the reasons why I chose to re-render this in charcoal versus use the original picture in Photoshop is because of the blurriness of the enlargement. So one of the artistic values of being able to do this by hand is that I can accent the parts of the piece that I want to and get rid of the less intrinsically pleasing parts. Bringing in the other ear. So one of the things that I wanted to do when I went through and I rendered these ears with this mane is I wanted to make sure that the ears actually stood out as an anatomical feature on the horse rather than like in the picture where you can barely tell. You almost have to look for the ears in this picture. So I used the mane and some of the shading around the neck to enhance them rather than to hide them. So in this way, when we go through and we're shading the neck, I'm purposely putting the deepest tones and the deepest shadow underneath the mane to define the edge of the mane and the base of the mane. And at the edge of the forelock, so that the ears still remain some of the deepest tones without becoming overly imposing. Just giving some directionality to the hair in the mane and giving some depth and value to the mane itself. For the ears and the mane, I mainly stuck to the carbon pencil because there tends to be less tracking with the blending stump and with the tortillons that I have a tendency of liking to use. The softer pencils like the HB and the 4B have a tendency of leaving quite a bit of carbon on the blending stumps, which I can use in other aspects of this drawing where I just need to track in some value. But for the mane, because I wanted to keep the highlights really pure, I stuck with the carbon pencil in order to keep the tracking down. So just going through and adding some shadow to the mane and really accenting that line in the mane. And just giving some weight to the neck. So now this is the first part of some of the tack and equipment. This is going to be a really heavy tack and equipment episode. So if you're looking for anatomy, I do apologize. It's not quite going to be in here. So this is the second of the two shafts. Because we've already created the surrounding environment for this shaft, we can actually go through and finish off the lighting versus the first shaft where I haven't quite established a background tone. And you'll notice on the reins that in the reference picture, the reins have very little contrast in compared to the neck and the surrounding muscle tone. In fact, if you're just glancing at the picture, you can barely tell where the rein is. And I didn't think this was very justified to the whole overall piece. because I think at this point that layout wise and compositionally, that the rein should lead your eye from the front of the horse back to the second subject, which would be the carriage and the nuns. So instead of truly copying what was in the reference picture, this gets into kind of artistically rendering it, deciding where you want your focus to be versus what the actual shot is. Getting into this breastplate a little bit. This is the widest piece of leather tack on this horse. And so it's important to kind of make sure that I'm giving it the curve and adjustments that it needs. Again, one of the things that was really sadly lost in the shot when I did this was all the detail in the tack and the equipment. The closer shots reveal the finer details and the complexity of the tack, but unfortunately, while this shot is really wonderful for a layout, it doesn't do any justice to the tack and the equipment. While looking at this buckle, and I did spend about 20 minutes on this buckle, and we'll only be on it for a few minutes. It's really important to note that you can barely tell that this piece of leather and the shaft, I mean, a lot of it, the tonality is gone from it as far as where the picture is. But my suggestion would be is if you're looking to really get the depth out of some of your details, like in your tack, practice drawing eggs or circles or squares and basic shapes, because this will help you define your shadows and your highlights. And then kind of break some of this, the individual parts of your tack down in order to figure out what pieces and what aspects of the tack you want to emphasize. Going through and just adding in a little bit of notation for myself for later about where the mane comes up in. And as you can see, some of the guidelines that are on the paper are quite a bit bigger than what I'm actually making in the final rendering. So I would have a square notating that this would be a buckle or a ring. And then once I get down to it, the actual buckle, such as like this one, is quite a bit smaller than what I actually made in my guide notes. With tight pieces of tack like this and tight pieces where tight little highlights and tight little shadows are required, I did go in with an X-Acto knife and just kind of pick out and scratch out where I would want a single highlight, because they could be so thin as just to be like almost a hair width thin. The other tool I wound up using was a dental tool to just very lightly scrape out some of the surface tone. Going in with the darkest values on this section of the tack. I really wanted it to emphasize the weight of the withers in front of the piece of equipment, so you could actually tell that there was quite a bit of strength going in underneath that, and kind of accent that this is where we're really getting into quite a bit of technicality as far as the fact that this isn't just a bridle piece, it's just not a Western piece. There's not going to be a saddle here. And you do kind of wind up jumping around and kind of working on this top to bottom visually, trying to make sure all the values are kind of lining up. I can always go in and darken all of these if I wish, but it's really hard to come back through and lighten them up. So minor little notations like the buckles, I want to make sure that I'm not darkening too much, and I'm retaining some of the details that you really can't see. Like on this buckle here that I'm working on, you can't even see the little tongue to the buckle itself. It just becomes a blob in the photograph, and so in rendering it in charcoal I can come back through and give it the detail that I really want it to have. Same thing with this buckle here. I actually wound up using a few different shots of the harness. I'm only mentioning the one here and the one reference here, so you can kind of understand how my camera distorted how heavy this buckle is versus how light I decided to render it. I don't want there to be too much emphasis on the hardware, but I do want it to be nice clean edges so you can tell what it is, versus on the reference picture where it kind of looks blobbish and soft. And a lot of it has to do with how much I was zoomed in. A lot of it has to do with the motion of the horse and how far away I was shooting it. So in re-rendering it, I can come back through, lighten up the weight of the buckles, and giving it the clean edges that it actually does have. Putting in a little bit of shadowing and tone into the body of the horse. Putting in some of the top to this harness. One of the biggest challenges in re-rendering this was really going back through and putting back in the defined detail to the harnessing and to the rest of the subject. And in my notations here, I had this guide ring sketched out quite a bit bigger than it actually was. But again, my lines were just basically used as notations. This is where the guide ring is. This is kind of the angle it was. But even as I went through and I was putting this in, I decided that it looked a little oblong. It looked a little bit in the wrong spot. So you can always go through and adjust your final renderings appropriately. Going back in more of the shaft. This is the leather wrapped part of the shaft. So it will be darker than the regular wood exposed section. And again, a lot of this tack I'm just going in with the carbon pencil and the two blending stumps because I didn't want a lot of tracking to cause extra noise in the shot. Part of the guide straps. A little bit of shadow for the tack. Make sure it has some weight. And even though some of these pieces of equipment are the reins or pieces of leather, whatever have you not, are very thin. Case in point, there's a piece of leather that wraps around the shaft right here. It's probably not even an 1/8 inch thick, and even on the reference picture that's on display right there, you can't even tell really what that is other than it's just a loop. In going through and taking my time and really giving the detail to the simple piece of leather that's wrapped around the shaft, it makes it that much more realistic, and it'll help to define the rest of the picture as I'm going along. Starting in on the right rear leg, I really wanted to make sure that we're giving some contrast to the gut and the underbelly. And I do apologize, I'm not really sure why the camera and the table started shaking. And all I'm really doing in the section that you can't really see, and I do apologize, is basically just filling in this part of the shaft and where the rein comes back. There's not a whole lot of detailing going on. It's a lot of blocking in. But yeah, for some reason it kept going on for a few minutes. One of the things that I chose not to do in here is to fill in the tail section, and that's because there was so much contrast in the front of the mane versus the section of the tail. There's a lot of very light tones in the mane, and they don't carry through into the tail. In fact, you can easily lose the tail between the end of the horse and the beginning of the carriage, and so I was worried that it would not carry through in the painting, well, in the drawing, if I continued to render it. So I'm leaving that until after I get done with the background so that I make sure that it stands out. Just bringing this leather strap back. Starting to bring down the muscle tone into the left rear leg. Just giving some curved dimension to the hip. One of the things that I wanted to kind of work on when I was going through rendering this is that when I did the leather section of the shaft, I was careful to make sure that the blending was very smooth versus the section that I'm working on right now on that shaft, where I did leave a few lines purposely visible so it would kind of give some indication of the grain in the wood of the shaft. Another section that you can barely tell on this picture is the piece of leather goes back around the horse's leg. And again, gets back into that value between the photo that I'm working from and being able to artistically render it, where I've got other pictures to work from, and whether or not I want to accent what's in the painting, or if I'm not blindly just photocopying it. And I think that this in particular shot right here really emphasizes that statement, because the metal pieces of the harness and even the strap that's carried over and wrapped around the shaft of this cart stand out with much more detail than what's actually in the photograph. Giving a little weight to this left leg. Following some of the muscle tone. This is a good part where knowing the anatomy is very useful. You want to know where the muscles and the tendons are going, because you can easily lose some of that definition and get very lost in just trying to render something like a leg. Finishing off the rear feet. Just trying to put some weight underneath these feet. Like I said, Halflingers are not necessarily a feathered breed, like a Clydesdale or a Percheron, but this in particular horse had a little bit of feathering on its hocks, and it seemed to be one of those things that I liked about this. I think it added to it rather than detracting to it, so I kept it. I did not clean up the feet at all. But like I said in the first installment, because they're a draft breed, that have more of those dishpan kind of feet, where they're not as tall and they're more splayed out for giving more hoof to surface contact, so they have more ability to pull off some traction. Just going to finish up these feet a little bit, and then we're going to get into the second half of this, which is going to be all on that cart. So as much as the nuns were dressed in black, and that does add a lot of weight to the subjects, I still had to keep in mind that the cart itself and the buggy itself still needed to have a little bit of weight. So I have my notations for the tail here, but I needed to keep going with making sure that the weight for the emphasis for the different weights that were present in the buggy were accounted for. So the darkest points being right below the foot wheel, where the nuns have their feet resting, and underneath the wheels themselves. Putting the spokes to the wheels in, with the heaviest emphasis shadow-wise being by the hub of the wheel and by the edge of the wheel. The actual hub of the wheel being a metal surface, and being the least amount lit, so. Oh, bother. So this was not actually a steel-wheeled buggy, although it there are such things as wooden wheeled with steel, instead of having rubber inflated tires, it would have like just a steel rim on them. This one actually had a very, very small inflated tire on it. Despite the fact that in the shot the horse's tail does come over where I'm drawing, I can easily go in with either the dental pick or the X-Acto knife and come back through and take some of the finer hairs out, which would only add to it. So I did go over where my notations for the tail went, but not too hard. I don't want to be digging into the paper too much later. The inside of the rim to the wheel. One of the things that was important, because this is an inflated wheel, is to make sure that I'm putting a little weight between the rim of the wheel and the actual inflation of the wheel. Going into the wheel, into the footwell, where effectively you would rest your heads, your feet, your heads, wow, little misspoke there. Alright, so using the ruler to kind of make sure that I'm keeping my edges nice and straight. Not necessarily a thing that I normally would incorporate in an animal portrait, but because we're doing man-made mechanical things, we have quite a few straight edges, so better to emphasize the hard edge than to have it be all rickety and hand-rendered. There's a little bit of space there. I would say there's probably like a ½ inch or an inch in between the slats in these boards. In the shot, you can see some of the definition between, like, I'm sure that's like either a foot or some clothing or something like that. To me, that wasn't really too vitally important to the tail of this carriage. I think more of my emphasis was put on the uh, buckles and the harnessing for the horse than small things like whether or not you could see through the slat in this wood, so I chose to ignore it. And again, one of the things that it is really intrinsical versus the picture is being able to bring some of this detail to the carriage out. Really, some of these details just look like little blobs of shade and color, well, shade and value in this shot versus how the drawing is going to wind up being. So it'd be really hard to tell that this piece of leather that's coming around and is looped back over the shaft, give that some nice contrast and color. I see, keep saying color, value. So it gives it that three-dimensional feeling. I do have to note that because I normally make my largest pieces 11 by 14, I do have to correct myself from the first episode. This is actually not an 11 by 14. Upon grabbing a ruler and kneading it for a straight edge, I discovered I had misspoke. It is actually a 14 by 17, not 11 by 14. So this piece is actually quite a bit bigger than I originally stated, and I do apologize. I felt kind of stupid when I realized that I had said that multiple times incorrectly. So one of the things that was kind of nice about using the straight edge is it gave me a very clean edge to the footwell of this buggy. And it gave me the ability to add a lot of punch and contrast to the beginning of this piece of equipment. So one of the very hard things to do was to figure out where the curves were in the shaft, because it becomes a square piece of wood where it actually attaches to the buggy itself, and is a round shaft out where it comes out alongside the horse. So I did have to check a couple different reference pictures to figure out where it flattened out and in what way the lines were created that defined it being a round shaft versus a square shaft. I'm just trying to figure out here where I was going to put each individual aspect. I have a lot that's coming together here. There's the actual guardrail to the buggy that's above and beyond the footwell, and that's what the horse itself would hit if it were to back up. And then I've got the footwell, and I've got a lot of busyness with different aspects of this cart, and then the beginning of our nuns themselves. So I have to figure out what I have to prioritize and what I'm going to throw away and what I'm going to keep as far as details. Putting a little weight behind some of the footwell boards. One of the things that got really kind of confusing is the fact that the wheel that's on the screen is actually the right outside wheel, and it's the outside wheel compared to where you're viewing it. The wheel that's on the right side would be the inside wheel or the outside wheel, and that bottom board that is, and again, it's hard to tell in this reference picture whether or not it's an axle. I don't believe it's an axle, or if it's actually another part to the cart, was really hard to figure out, and it leads itself to an optical illusion because it actually goes back behind the wheel. And so after I put it in and I realized there was a little bit of an optical illusion there, I decided to put it aside for a moment because I don't know that it was actually lending itself to helping whoever's viewing this to actually help figure out how this cart is designed or built, or if it was actually some piece of the background, or if it was actually just adding confusion to this piece. It could just wind up in the end being extra noise that detracts from the actual enjoyment of the piece. Bringing in the outside wheel. And again, lots of tones in this cart, with the darkest tones and values being the clothing of the nuns, because the nuns are dressed in black. But I still have to give some weight and some emphasis to the aspects and the architecture to the rig. And again, with these inflated tires not being a steel-rimmed tire, it's important to add a little bit of contour and contrast and tone to the inflated part of the tire versus the hard side of the rim. And I'm not entirely sure if the buggy would be, as reenactors put it, period or accurate to the time period in which this piece is rendered, but honestly, to me, it's not important enough that the buggy is steel rimmed or if it's inflated tire rimmed, being pertinent to the story for The Sound of Music. I don't know that anybody really viewing the piece is going to become hugely obstinate about the fact that they did or did not have inflated tires at the juncture of World War II in Austria. So the inside rim, where the spokes meet the rim, this is all wood here, and while the rim itself is circular, the inside circumference is flat. and going through and doing the spokes. And the shot that I have right there, there is motion blur in the spokes, and so you do lose some of the definition in the shadowing and some of the detail in the spokes because the buggy and the cart are in motion, the horse and the cart are in motion, so you do lose some of the definition, and was trying to go through and do this as fast as possible. So again, putting in the weight underneath the air inflated tires. If I wanted to just make that flat, it would just be it would lack the shadowing on the outside edge, which would be closest to the buggy. It wouldn't have a kind of curved shadow to it. Okay, so just as I'm going through and kind of finishing up this episode, I do appreciate you guys all watching and following along as I'm doing this. Again, this is 6 times normal speed, so if I apologize if you got bored, but if you think it was boring watching at 6 times normal speed, you should have saw how boring it was when I was actually doing it. Because unfortunately, tack can be exceptionally taxing to do because there's such intricate little parts of it, and it goes very, very slowly, as do parts of this cart, as we're still working on it. In this part, I'm just kind of attaching the end of that shaft to the axle and the underside, and then just going through putting the bottom of the seat on. In the next episode, we're going to be finishing up the cart and the nuns, and then we're going to be going into the detail of the background. So if you are really interested and you're following along with this piece, feel free to like and comment on the video. If you're looking to see what else I'm up to, feel free to check out my Facebook page. It's Morning Hawk Creations on Facebook. Otherwise, feel free to subscribe and you'll get the latest for whatever I'm uploading next. I still have more installments coming up with the Tiger Cub that I was working on. I have more installments coming up on this in particular piece. And dozens and dozens more. I just have to get all kinds of time to get together and just put them all on video. Thanks for watching, guys. Again, feel free to subscribe and like the videos. And I'll catch you later, okay? Thanks. Bye.